This morning, our two guest speakers are Dr. Julie Smith from ADAS and Dr. Jon Helliwell from BASF, and they'll discuss about weed disease control and nitrogen efficiency. So it's fair to say that nitrogen is a hot topic at the moment, but I can assure you this isn't something new for BASF. We've targeted a number of solutions over many years to help to protect and optimize nitrogen input, because we believe it is crucial to maximize the value of each nitrogen unit applied to our land, because it has a positive impact on the yield and on the farm profitability, of course, but also this is just better for the environment. So we've developed urease inhibitors to reduce ammonia losses and also nitrification inhibitors to target nitrous oxide emissions and reduce nitrate leaching. And more recently, we've also launched a new feature within our Xavio Field Manager tool, which can now create variable maps to better target your end applications. This morning, we'll be targeting a very different aspect. We'll explore if and how fungicides can help in enhancing nitrogen use efficiency. So to answer that question, I'm really pleased to welcome Dr. Julie Smith. So Julie, you're a senior plant pathology researcher at ADAS, and you're a well-known expert in the field of crop pathogens. And I know, Julie, you're passionate about making science accessible and useful to everyone. So I'm really excited to learn more about your recent research, and I'll leave you the floor now. It's over to you, Julie.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Muriel. I hope I can live up to that introduction. So I wanted to really answer three questions with the data I'm going to show, three very topical questions, I think. The first one being about the impact of high fertilizer prices on the economic optimum N rate. The second question is around how much yield might you lose by chopping back nitrogen. And the third question really is about whether fungicides can help mitigate against those negative impacts of high fertilizer prices and reduced N rates. So just to be upfront, I am a pathologist, so nitrogen and fertilizer is not my area of expertise. So if there are any very specific questions about that, I would refer them to my physiology colleagues. But of course, I work on the crossover with pathology and physiology. So just to set the scene a little bit for 2021, the season we've just had, it was a very wet May. Of course, we had quite a dry April, but a very wet May, much wetter than the average, combined with, these are temperature data, combined with quite cool temperatures in May. So all in all, that gave us a late but quite a severe septoria epidemic. So we ran a couple of trials in 2021 looking at the interaction of nitrogen and fungicides. And we ran two separate trials, but actually in the same field. The one trial looked at gravity, which has a recommended list rating of 5.2 against septoria, so quite a susceptible variety. And the second variety we looked at was Graham, which is a 6.8 and more resistant against septoria. We had 5 different nitrogen rates here, ranging from 37 kilograms per hectare up to 370. So what we did was we took the farmer's typical standard nitrogen program, and we applied our different nitrogen rates at exactly the same timings and splits as he would put on his commercial rate. And we did also correct for sulfur too, so it was just the nitrogen that was reduced. We had 3 different fungicides. We had an untreated, we had Revistar XE, and we compared that with a competitor, Ascra. So Just to give you an idea of the kind of disease pressure we had, I've got here disease progress curves from the high rate nitrogen untreated plots. So the graph on the left is gravity, and I've got the 3 different leaf layers, leaf 1 being the flag leaf, of course, leaf 2 and leaf 3. And you can see that we did indeed, as I said, it was quite a late epidemic, but we did achieve very high levels of septoria in both the varieties. The graph on the right is Graham, and again, although it was a more resistant type, we still eventually had high levels of septoria, but the whole epidemic was shifted through time, which is exactly what the resistant varieties do. That's how they operate. So no surprises there. A really good test of the products being quite severe septoria. So if we look in a little bit more detail at the 276 N rate, this is septoria on leaf 1, the flag leaf. So this is just on the 19th of July, so quite late on in the season. And you can see there in both varieties, the Revistar is doing a really good job of keeping that septoria in check there. And that pattern of effects was seen across all of the N rates. I'm not going to go through each nitrogen rate on its own because that would be a little bit dull, but just to say that pattern of effect was observed across all of those nitrogen rates in both varieties. So I just want to think a little bit now about the disease assessments and how we measure disease in these experiments. And I mean, traditionally, what happens is we show data where we've gone out at a certain point in time and made a disease assessment. So, for example, if we made a disease assessment at the end of May, start of June here, where the red bar is, and I presented a bar chart of those data, it would look something like this. So fungicide 1 being the blue line, fungicide 2, there wouldn't be a lot of difference between them on the untreateds. But then if instead of showing you those data, if we then actually went out and made an assessment later on, so at the end of June, start of July, here, if we made an assessment at this time point, and I just showed you one graph of the data, it would look quite different. And you can see there we've got higher disease, of course, and bigger differences between the products. So just by the data that we show, or when we make our disease assessments, we can get quite a different picture of the performance of products. So this for me is a little bit not the whole picture, because what we want to do is to understand the size of the effect that we're having from a product, but also how long that effect persists for. So what I like to do is to make sequential disease assessments and plot the whole of the disease progress curve, as we've done here, you can see, so that we get a real picture of how those products perform throughout the whole of the critical grain forming period. And I think that's really quite important to do. So if we've got our disease progress curves here, so every dot on the curve is a disease assessment. So if we want then to have a single value of the performance of that product through time, which encompasses both the size of the effect and how long that effect lasted for, then all we've got to do is calculate the areas under the curve, okay? So that would give us then a proper picture of the product performance. Now, this at the moment, this is a septoria on the flag leaf. So we would have to do this for every leaf layer. But if you think about the way yield is formed in a winter wheat crop, foliar disease takes out green area, which then reduces the crop's ability to intercept light. That's photosynthetically active radiation, is PAR, which of course reduces its ability to produce dry matter and yield. And when you look at the work that we did years and years ago in the Wheat Disease Management Guide, you can see then that it's not just the flag leaf that's important in terms of its contribution to yield, it's the top 4 leaves of the canopy. So what we really want to do then is take the thinking about assessing disease at many times. We want to scale that up to the canopy level, okay, because we don't just want to look at one particular leaf layer. So we can do that by calculating green leaf area index values and then plotting a curve. So everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with GAI values, green area index values. So this is exactly the same, except we're only interested in the leaf part of the crop. So what we do is we collect a metre square of above ground material. We then separate that material into its different component parts, so leaves, different leaf layers, stems, ears. We measure the size of the leaves on a green area machine, and we know what proportion of each leaf is green or diseased because we can assess it, so we can adjust our leaf area values. And that gives us then, if we add those up, that gives us a green leaf area index value, which is effectively the amount of green leaf you've got per metre square of ground area. So if we make a green leaf area index measurement when the flag leaves are fully expanded, which is in this year the 19th of May, we do it again a week or so later, and again and again. And then we join up the points, just like we did with the disease progress curve. You can see straight away then that the Revisol, which is the top blue line, it has a bigger green area for longer than the untreated plot. So again, if we want to work with a single value that is effectively an integral of both the size and the duration of the healthy green canopy, then all we've got to do is calculate the areas under the curve. And we call this a HAD value, healthy area duration. So the HAD value is a combined measure of healthy canopy size and duration, just to explain what that is. So if we look then at our HAD values, I've got them on the same scale here. We've got gravity on the left in the blue bars and Graham on the right. You can see, first of all, that Graham, being more resistant, of course, generally had less disease, more green area. So right across the board, it had higher HAD values than the gravity. But when you look within each grouping of fungicides, so each group of bars is a fungicide product, when you look within each groups, you can see very nice responses to nitrogen, of course, which is unsurprising. We would expect to see that. But you can also see that on top of those nitrogen responses, that the Revistar is giving us an increase for each relative nitrogen grouping above the untreated and above the competitor products. So if we then fast forward that to yield, we see exactly the same pattern of effects as we saw for our HAD values. Again, they're on the same scale. So, and interestingly, if you look at the untreateds, first of all, in gravity, you can see that there was quite a flat response in terms of yield to the increasing nitrogen rates. And similarly with the Graham, if you look at the untreated, which is the first group of bars, there was quite a flat response as soon as you got up to about 180, 190 kilograms of N, it really tailed off. So that gives you an indication of the response of the nitrogen alone without any fungicide products applied. So then if you look at the addition of fungicide products, you can see that they've lifted the yields relative to the untreated nitrogen, accompanying nitrogen rates. But also you can see that overall the Revistar in both of the varieties is giving you a lift above the competitor products. So we use the HAD model because it's a very good way of explaining yield. You get a much better relationship between yield and HAD than you do if you just try to plot yield and percentage septoria, or yield and percentage green area, for example. So I've put all of the treatment means from both trials onto the graph here. And you can see, first of all, that gravity are the dark blue circles. Gravity had generally lower HAD values, which we saw from the data, and lower yields compared with Graham, which Graham are the light blue triangles. But both of the varieties are along that same relationship, so they're not behaving any differently. So it doesn't really matter whether you're sowing a susceptible or a resistant variety. You can still get the benefits from the nitrogen and fungicide interactions. And what we can see really is that the relationship is mostly linear, so it's mostly a straight line until you get right up to the upper end of the HAD values, where it just starts to plateau and tail off. So this is, I think, an extremely important fundamental point, because what it's saying is that generally we don't quite have enough HAD in our varieties. So if we can do something to increase that green area for a little bit longer, we can generally push up yield and get that extra little bit of yield out of our crop. And this is really absolutely corroborates what we know about winter wheat, in that it's generally considered to be a source limited crop in the UK, which means that on the whole it doesn't quite have enough green area to fulfill its yield capacity on the whole. So if we think then a little bit now about the questions around fertilizer, I just want to remind everybody about some of the fertilizer basics, as I call them. So the economic optimum N rate, it's the nitrogen rate at which the cost of applying 1 extra kilogram of nitrogen gives us less value in terms of additional yield. And if we look in the AHDB Nutrient Management Guide, which was formerly called the RB209, I still refer to it as the RB209, we can see that the recommendations are based on a fertilizer cost to grain price break-even ratio. This is called the BER. And for cereals, we tend to use a break-even ratio of 5. So that means you need 5 kilograms of grain to pay for 1 kilogram of nitrogen. Now, at the moment, the way nitrogen prices have gone recently, we believe that the break-even ratio is more like 10 to 1 at the minute. So, you would need 10 kilograms of grain to pay for 1 kilogram of nitrogen. Now, I have to say, with the situation, things seem to be changing almost on a week-by-week basis. So it's quite important to go and work out this, on your own farm. But generally speaking, what happens is that the optimum N rate tends to decrease as the break-even ratio goes up. So my physiology colleagues, Pete Berry and Roger Bradley and the team have done a really nice review, which is published by AHDB. It's called Review of How Best to Respond to Expensive Fertilizer Nitrogen. And I honestly would recommend everybody go and look at that. It's available online on the AHDB website. It's a very easy read. and it's very insightful. So I've taken a couple of charts out of that review. And so the graph we're looking at here is a sort of a sliding scale of break-even ratios and how that affects the amount of nitrogen that should be used. So anything in red is a decrease in N rate, and anything in black is an increase. So I've put an arrow on the 10:1 break-even ratio for cereals there. You can see a black arrow. And if you scroll across then, that suggests that at a break-even ratio of 10:1, you ought to be chopping your nitrogen by about 50 kilograms per hectare. Now, the rule of thumb, very, very rough rule of thumb, is that for every unit increase in the break-even ratio, you reduce N by about 10 kilograms per hectare. So the next logical question then is, if you reduce N, what impact will that have on yield? And again, my physiology team have very conveniently produced a table to help answer that question. And it's actually not as much as you might think, because when we look at N optima, we're operating really on the flat part of the curve. So you can reduce nitrogen a little bit either way and not have too big a effect on yield. So again, if you look at the table from the AHDB review, we can see that reducing nitrogen by 50 kilograms, so that's the column on the left, will give you an approximate 0.35 impact on yield, ton per hectare yield reduction on average. I mean, obviously there are, it can be a little bit more, can be a little bit less, but these are just average figures from when we reviewed all of our nitrogen response trials, and we had about 35 trials to look at to produce these data. So that's a sort of a ballpark figure. So there are tables in this review, and you can, I've just taken one table, so you can read across the top, looking at your fertilizer type and what you've paid for it, and you can go down the column, look at your grain price, and then it will give you some guidance on how much to increase or decrease nitrogen by. So as I said, I would urge everybody to go and have a read of this report. So in terms then of what can fungicides do to help mitigate this negative impact of high fertilizer prices and reductions in yield, there are three things that fungicides can do then. They can increase yield at the optimum N rate. They can increase yield at the same N rate. So if you've bought your nitrogen and you've decided this is what I'm going to put on, you might be looking at ways of absolutely optimizing your yield of that. Or you can chop your nitrogen a little bit and still maintain yield with good fungicide programs. So this is a theoretical graph. So when we look to the data to see whether our theories hold true, we can see that exactly what we predicted as being possible is indeed possible. And you can see quite clearly with Revistar, for example, that it does have a higher optimum N. So you could effectively afford to chop your nitrogen a little bit and still maintain the same level of yield that you would achieve with a competitor product or an untreated plot, for example. Or you can indeed decide that you're going to stick at a certain N rate. And if you look vertically, then you can see that using Revistar does indeed give you a little bit of extra yield. So there was a question about how the impact of the different component parts. Is it the Revisol or is it the Xemium that's doing the work? Well, the answer is it's both, but people wanted a little bit of confidence that it was Revisol that was actually having this effect too. So we carried out a completely separate trial in 2019 where we compared straight products. So this is just the two different azoles compared, and you can see exactly the same pattern of effects. So these aren't fitted curves. These are the actual data points just joined up with a line term, so there's no trickery or statistics going on. And you can see a really nice uplift again of Revisol at those different nitrogen rates. So in summary then, we had a late epidemic in 2021, generally across the UK, but we still did have high disease pressure. There's a strong relationship between had and yield, and we can see that each unit increase in had gives you an approximate 0.03 tonne per hectare increase in yield, because we're on the straight part of that relationship. We've got a higher optimum N rate in Graham compared with gravity, unsurprisingly, because it's more resistant. But and we can conclude then from our data that Revistar, it can increase yield at the commercial N rate compared with competitors, or if you do decide to reduce your N rate, it can maintain yield at reduced N rates. So I think my take-home message really is that even if you are going to reduce your nitrogen this year, don't be tempted to be too light with the fungicide programs, because we have seen that it's worth investing in good disease management, even if you reduce your nitrogen rate. So thank you very much for listening and for giving me the opportunity to share my data with you. I think we're going to hand over to John now.
Yeah, thanks, Julie, for this very comprehensive presentation. There are already lots of questions for you, Julie, but we'll address them at the end of the session. It's my pleasure now to welcome Dr. Jon Helliwell. John, you're our Business Development Manager at BASF and our fungicide technical expert in the UK. It's fair to say that 2021 has been a challenging but interesting year in terms of weed disease control. So John, you'll review for us some key learnings from last year, and you'll give your view on how to action them for the coming season. It's over to you, John.
Yeah, thank you very much, Muriel, and thank you, Julie, for that very comprehensive presentation. So I've titled this part of the talk "Actions from 2021." Now, we all know that it's important not to base our decision-making process and our actions on the back of 1 year, and I don't think any advice has changed this year, because 2021 was so different in so many ways. But in 2021, there were a number of very interesting observations and challenges that did come up around fungicide performance, how different modes of action performed, and there's plenty to discuss. And if you haven't already had the opportunity, I recommend you get in touch with your local BASF agronomy manager, because there's plenty more than I can cover in the next kind of 25 minutes or so. But for that period of time, just so this morning, I'd just like us to consider what happened in 2021, and more importantly, how that builds on our understanding of both the season, but how we can use that to predict and understand how products might perform going forwards. And that starts with what actually happened in 2021. What factors influenced the septoria epidemic? And actually, there are a number of things that impacted the success of fungicide programs. T1 applications were incredibly difficult and challenging to time, and we will go through that a little bit this morning. When we look towards gaps, there was a significant time gap, probably because of that challenge with T1s, between T1s and T2s, and that had some quite big implications for how septoria developed, particularly on the upper canopy later in the season. When we look at leaves and we look at septoria epidemic development, there was a very unique disease development relative to how leaves emerged, and it was due to that very cool and dry April period that Julie's already discussed. We know there's been a lot of commentary around varietal response. I think this is an area that's still developing, but we know there are certain watch outs around genetics. Now, it doesn't affect all genetics equally, even within the same group, but I think there is a degree of unpredictability around varieties that needs to be considered. And we know that actually, when we look back and review 2021, it was an incredibly protectant season at the time of T1 and T2 applications. and actually modes of action and fungicides that could impact spores, and the spore development were very, very successful in 2021. And then there was a lot of market commentary and a lot of discussion in the build up to the T1, when T1 decisions were being made and when T2 decisions were being made around the need for fungicides. There was a perception that septoria disease pressure was quite low. And actually there was a lot of discussion in the market and on social media around the lack of need for certain fungicides. And I think that perception of fungicide requirement, in combination with all of the other factors on the screen, did impact how disease developed and how different fungicides performed, and particularly when it comes to longevity of control and what we were asking of different fungicides in 2021. So a combination of those factors means that in some situations, some are looking back on 2021 and they're questioning the value of their fungicide approach. They're questioning the success of their fungicide applications. And actually, when we look back, T1's typically time leaf 3 fully emerged. And when we look back to our trials data, we can see that over a big number of trials that BASF had in the ground in 2021, on average, there was a 4-day delay to leaf 3 emergence compared to 2020. So leaf 3 emerged 4 days later in 2021 compared to previous years and compared to a longer term average. And actually within the fields at the same time as that, there was very, very high levels of variation within leaf 3 emergence. So within the same field, treated in the same way, drilled on the same day, same variety, there were very, very different levels of leaf 3 emergence. So actually, as we were making decisions on when to apply T1 fungicides, we were making those applications. It was very difficult to uniformly time leaf 3 coverage with fungicides. And actually, T1s on the whole were applied by very similar calendar dates. So leaf 3s were emerging slightly later, but T1s were applied by the same calendar date. So actually, it was very, very difficult to correctly cover leaf 3 fungicide with fungicide. And when we looked at some of our Curacrop data, so that's what's on the screen now. So these are leaves that we go out at the T2 timing. So these have been treated with fungicide at T1. They've been treated with at T0, potentially. They've been treated with fungicide at T1. And then we go out and we sample various leaf layers. And we look at the amount of septoria DNA within those leaves. So this is a technique that we call Curacrop. And we've been doing it for a number of years now, 6 or 7 years. And actually at that T2 timing, so when we were applying T2s, if we look at the level of septoria DNA in leaf 3, we see that there was a very, very high level of septoria within leaf 3. And actually this has big implications, because that would have been a combination of potentially weaker products applied, whether it be less effective products or a lower dose, probably on this perception of lower disease pressure. There were then challenges in adequately covering leaf 3. And I think both of those factors have played into this high level of inoculum on leaf 3. But it's important to note that visually, this leaf 3 would have still looked green. What's interesting is then when we look at what happened in the rest of the season. So obviously T2s targeting flag leaf emergence. But what we saw as we came up to the T2 timing is, because of those early T1 applications, there was actually between 8 and 10 day, in some cases up to 12-day increased time between T1s and T2s. So we've got this situation where leaf 3 is highly infected with septoria. Visually it looks green, but there's a lot of septoria within the leaf. And then we've got this increased gap to the next fungicide application. So actually that leaf 3 continues to build septoria. Leaf 2 completely untreated at this point for a long period of time. And then the flag leaf is what we're clearly trying to protect with T2 applications. But what's really interesting is when you start to look at the level of septoria DNA in the upper canopy. And actually both leaf 2 and leaf 1, there was very little, surprisingly, there was very little septoria DNA in those leaves at that T2 timing. So at T2, we're obviously targeting fungicide coverage on leaf 1 and leaf 2. And actually those applications incredibly protectant on those upper 2 leaf layers. But we did have this situation where leaf 3 was highly infected. So we got a situation where those dry conditions were limiting the initial septoria development on those upper leaves, but we had a high level of inoculum on the lower canopy. And I just want to take you over to Herefordshire, and this was a trial that ADAS did for us in 2021. So traditionally, Rosemond, very, very high septoria pressure situation in Herefordshire. And on the blue bars here, you've got rainfall. And what's interesting is if we start to relate what we saw in terms of septoria epidemic by leaf layer, and then we overlay that onto rainfall, because what we can see is in May, very, very wet at Rosemond. So you'd anticipate that actually in that period you have a high level of infection. But when we actually look in an untreated crops and no fungicide applied at all, and what we've got here is 3 bars. The bottom grey bar is leaf 1, the middle orange bar is leaf 2, and the top blue bar is leaf 3. And this is septoria infection. So as you go from bottom to top, you're increasing the amount of septoria on the leaf. And what's really interesting is actually on the 15th of June, so middle of June, you only had 1% septoria on that flag leaf. 20 days after T2s were applied, only 1% septoria in an untreated situation on the flag leaf. T2s were highly protectant. And if we overlay onto that, when we applied those T2s, T2s to the fungicide treated crops were applied on the 26th of May. And actually at that time, there was no visual disease on any of those top 3 leaf layers. So highly protectant applications at T2, but it was following a period of very intense rainfall in May. But what this means, and the last piece really that we can look at is we've now got an understanding of where we stood from a leaf 3 emergence perspective, and we've also got an understanding of what different fungicides are capable of doing. And I just want to kind of relate this to what we know about different modes of action, because what we know from 2021 and this very protectant application is that in 2021 we had a year where septoria activity was highly effective on the spore stage of septoria development. And so if we remember what happens when septoria penetrates a leaf, and these are very high resolution images of septoria as it progresses through its life cycle and through its latent period. So on the left-hand side, you've got spores that land on a leaf. They start to grow randomly towards stomata. You then get, and in that position, you're in a very protectant area. The hyphae then grow, so the germ tubes grow towards the stomata. They infect the leaf through those stomata, and they start to infect the inner mycelium and the inner leaf mycelium. And they grow and they cause cell degradation. But what's important is every component on this chart here will not be visible visually from looking at the leaf. The leaf will still be green, even though you've got this high level of inner degradation. So on the left, you're talking about very protectant activity of fungicides. And then as you move towards the right, you're talking about a more curative situation. And the reason we're highlighting this is where you start to think about where different modes of action and where different fungicides work and are most effective. So STHIs, as an example, they sit on the outside of the leaf. Certainly initially, very, very good spore activity. They used to give very strong curative activity, but as resistance has continued to develop, some of that curative activity is now being lost or reduced from STHIs. So the arrow can probably be pulled back slightly from right to left for STHIs. We know that QOIs and strobulurins, and some will remember some of the old F500 data from Stephen Kildare at Chaggers. Even with QOI and strobulurin resistant septoria, G143A populations, we know that F500 is still effective, particularly in this preventative stage. this spore active stage. And actually those that used Comet or used F500 containing products in 2021 are reporting very, very visual benefits of that product on septoria last year. When we look about azoles, we know that actually triazoles and the azole group, that very, very protectant outside of the leaf activity is not really where they shine in terms of their strength. And actually, if we look at some of the AHDB curves, and you'll have seen some of the data, and we'll cover it, you look at some of the more conventional triazoles, so prothioconazole, it really was challenged in 2021. But put another way, I suppose, if you have a year where control of septoria spores is dominant and important, it's quite a rare situation. But if you do have that year, it's not a year where a fungicide like Revysol would necessarily perform at its best. But just before I show the next mode of action, which you'll know, I just want you to have a think about what you think the most effective mode of action was on spores. Because we were without it in 2021, and actually it's one of the first seasons now where we're having to come to terms with what life will be like without chlorothalonil. And it's just highlighted really just how exposed certain chemistry now is without the support of chlorothalonil. And that is a key learning from 2021, which we'll explore. But as we consider all of this, and as I said a couple of moments ago, there's some that were coming out of 2021 and are coming out of 2021, reviewing what they saw, particularly around the end of June, early July. And there were questions around fungicide performance and things not really performing as people would have necessarily expected. And I think some of those factors on the first slide really do account for a lot of what we can see. But there were some questions around resistance and resistance development, particularly around triazoles. And actually, if we look at some of our monitoring data, so you've got prothioconazole, prothiodesthio, on the left-hand side. So this is the metabolite of prothioconazole that's used by independent organisations, so NIAB, Rothamsted, to Chaggers, to kind of look at the resistant status of prothioconazole. And then on the right, you've got Revysol. And what we can see, between the light shading and the dark shading, it's the median ED50 value, so the dose that you require to control 50% of the population. And it's a standard measure of resistance. And what we can see is on the right-hand side, there's absolutely no difference in the ED50, so the dose of Revysol that you need to control 50% of septoria. And it's been stable now for the last 4 years. It's been absolutely rock solid. But on the left-hand side, you've got prothioconazole desthio, and actually there has been a clear trend and an increase in prothioconazole desthio ED50 for the last 4 years now. And so what we can talk about and what we can discuss with this sort of data is focusing on the foundation of our fungicide programs. We know that STHIs, we know that other at-risk mode of action need protection, and actually Revysol now remains the strongest partner to protect those at-risk modes of action going forwards. And if we just relate this to kind of product performance, and if we have a think about around how different products perform, particularly at T1 last year, a time where there was a perception that because leaves were green and because it was cool, because it was dry, a perception that we didn't require a strong level of potentially fungicide performance from our T1s. What we actually see, and this is across 38 replicated T1 comparisons in 2021, and where we've compared a litre of Ascra as a benchmark in the market to 0.75 Revystar. And what we see is a 0.24 tonne a hectare benefit on average across those 38 replicated T1 comparisons. And if we relate that to some sort of value, now obviously these prices change daily now, but at a wheat price of £185 a tonne, that equates to around £42 a hectare benefit from switching up from Ascra Expo in 2021 to Revystar at 0.75 litres a hectare. Or put another way, for every additional pound you chose to spend on Revystar at T1, that gained an additional £28 a hectare at those wheat prices. So there's a clear benefit now of stepping up to the strongest chemistry, and so stepping up to innovation chemistry at T1, and we'll explore where we stand at T2 in a moment, and then in future webinars. But at T1, despite the fact that there was very cool, dry conditions, a perception that fungicides were of less value in 2021, a clear benefit to stepping up to the strongest chemistry at T1. And as we come into the T2 timing, a lot of people refer to the AHDB fungicide performance curves, and understandably so. These trials are, specifically designed to pull apart fungicides. And actually, when we look at the protectant data, so this is data that was presented in December 2021 at the AHDB conference, actually very similar performance in disease control from the two fungicides that were tested in 2021 trials. So you've got Revastar and you've got Univoc, very similar performance dose for dose. And in a more eradicant situation, again, Revastar slightly outperforming from a disease control perspective, but percentage points difference in 2021 between these two products. Very similar performance. What's interesting is if you start to look at yield from these trials, and actually in 2021, across the 7 trials, there was, that both products performed very well, but there was a difference in yield between those two products. But what's interesting is if you look at the over-yeared analysis, the 3-year data set, 21 trials across 3 years, and actually at the doses that we're talking about at T1 or T2, very little difference in yield between Revastar and Univoc, but actually a clear difference in yield between innovation chemistry, either of those two products, and a more conventional standard in Ascra in these independent trials. But we've got a situation where actually in 2021, Univoc had a higher yield in these data sets than Revastar. But in the 3-year data set, there's no difference at all in yield at the doses that we're commercially considering on farm, which means that either in 2019 or in 2020, Revastar must have quite significantly out-yielded Univoc in order for that average to be flat in the 3-year data set, considering that 2021 yield will have been included in that 3-year data set also. And what we can start to have a look at is how different products have performed now over time, and get a good feel for, regardless of the season, regardless of how disease progresses, what we can expect in terms of performance from fungicides. And if we go back to Curacrop, so BASF data, so the Curacrop again is leaves that have been collected at that T2 timing. They've been treated at T0, they've been treated at T1 with fungicide. And what we're looking at is the level of Septoria DNA on those top 2 leaves, the flag leaf and leaf 2. And actually, if we look at 2017, we had very curative conditions. There was some level of Septoria DNA within those top 2 leaves as we were making that T2 application. So we did require curative activity from our fungicides in 2017 at T2. 2018 was exactly the same picture. There was some level of Septoria DNA in those top 2 leaves. 2019 was the same picture again, curative conditions at T2. Think back to 2020 and where we stood, very dry conditions, highly protectant in terms of T2 applications. And actually, we've just been through the 2021 data. Yes, there was Septoria on the lower canopy, particularly on leaf 3, as we were making these T2 applications, but on those top 2 leaves, which we're impacting with that T2 fungicide, highly protectant conditions on those top 2 leaves. And we can relate this then, so this is BASF data, and we can then relate this to what AHDB saw in their disease monitoring. So this was presented in 2020. So it's presented by Stuart Knight in December 2020. And what we see as we look at the left graph, so as we move from left to right, we're increasing the dose of each of the products on test. In 2017, we had Ascra, we had Librax, and they had Alatacera in those trials. Some of the products change year on year, but you can see that which products were included. And as we go from bottom to top, we're now looking at disease control. So the higher the line, the stronger the fungicide in terms of controlling Septoria. And what we see between 2017 and 2019, we've got conventional products, conventional co-formulations in there. And we see this gradual decline in performance between 2017 and 2019 of conventional fungicides. In 2020, it was the first year that Revastar in the green line on the top was included. And we see this clear differentiation between Revastar and between conventional products in Ascra. But what's interesting is this was presented in 2020. If we relate this to what we found, what was presented this year, so focus on the 2017 graph for a moment, because in 2021, this was presented. And actually in that data set, they did have Revastar and they did have Univoc in AHDB trials, but because they weren't registered, they weren't presented at the AHDB conference. But in 2021, obviously Univoc gained registration and this was presented. And in a curative situation at T2, in BASF monitoring, we see this benefit in AHDB trials of Revastar over Univoc, but we also see this benefit of innovation chemistry, so both of those products over conventional co-formulants in Ascra. 2018, BASF monitoring shows a curative situation. In AHDB data, again, a benefit of Revastar over Univoc, but a value of using stronger chemistry, strong innovation chemistry over Ascra. 2019, a curative situation in BASF Curacrop data. Again, a benefit of Revastar over Univoc, and again, a benefit of both of those innovation products over a conventional standard in Ascra. 2020, highly protectant, very little difference, no difference at all really between Revastar and Univoc, but a clear difference between innovation chemistry and conventional standards on disease control, on septoria control. 2021, Ascra now no longer in those trials. And again, a very, very small benefit a very small difference between Revastar and Univoc. Actually, as we said, Univoc had a slight edge in 2021 in AHDB data. But actually, when we summarize that, we can see that actually innovation chemistry, whether it be Revastar, whether it be Univoc, stronger chemistry, in the absence of CTL, so in the position that we're moving into in 2022, is the only way now to adequately control septoria. And actually, when we look at what we learned from 2020 and 2021, we need to account for the fact that at T2, they were highly, highly protectant in terms of application. And we know, looking at the previous data sets from 2017, 2018, and 2019, there is a difference in product performance when curative conditions are more prevalent. And actually, Revastar now is proven in both protectant and curative situations. And the final piece that I'd just like to cover is this, because when we talk about resistance and we talk about fungicide performance, it's important to relate that to what we're actually seeing in the field. We've shown you some of the BASF monitoring data of prothioconazole desthio versus Revasol. We showed you that Revasol has remained stable for the last 4 years. But what's interesting, and this was presented again at the AHDB conference in December 2021, and here we've got the performance of prothioconazole over time in the field. And we start to see this change in performance since 2001 right up to now here 2020. And as we look towards what was presented in 2021, this was the latest data set. And actually we can see that there's about a 60% difference in outright septoria efficacy between Revasol in the diamond on the top and prothioconazole at the bottom. So there's a clear differentiation now between triazoles, and actually that has important implications for what Julie covered and what Julie showed around the role of prothioconazole and Revasol in ability to control disease. But also it links into some of the nitrogen work that Julie discovered and Julie went through around the role that fungicide control plays in strengthening a plant's ability to actively utilize nitrogen. So really, just to summarize, so Julie gave a very, very clear and very, very useful introduction to HAD and healthy area duration. And actually the impact of maintaining a healthy canopy is absolutely immense on yield and the bottom line. And actually across both susceptible and resistant varieties, we know that Revastar has now been proven in both situations. And then the 2021 work and some of the previous work that Julie showed in 2019 and some of the other work BASF have done with ADAS has shown that actually Revasol and Revastar is able to improve nitrogen utilization, so able to improve the conversion of nitrogen to yield through that enhancement to disease control. And then what we've discussed is that from 2021, some are challenging their fungicide approach and they're challenging what they saw in 2021 as a season. But actually, there are a number of factors that need to be considered and debated, particularly around T1 intensity and T1 performance, in dictating ultimately how much Septoria then came into crops in 2021. But there is this clear benefit now and this clear differentiation between innovation chemistry at T1 and T2. But actually, Revastar now is proven across different varieties, proven across different seasons, and importantly, it's proven in both protectant and curative conditions when needed. And actually, it's the only fungicide that is proven in both situations, not just in what we saw in that highly protectant timing at T2 in 2021. So with that, Muriel, I'll pass back over to you, and I think there's a time for a bit of Q&A. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, John, for that very great presentation. I'm calling back Julie on the stage with us now for some questions. We've got lots of questions, so I think the first one will be for you, Julie. It's related to your trials. So in the ADAS trials showing the full rates of Ascra and Revastar at T2, do you know what other fungicides were applied at the other timings, T0, T1, and T3?
Oh, sorry, I should have made that clear at the start. So we didn't apply a T1 or a T3. These were purely T2 trials, which I find even more incredible to get that yield response out of a single T2 application.
Perfectly clear. Thanks for that clarification. But maybe another one for you, Julie. Is that true, or would you agree that artificial nitrogen stretches the cell's walls, which could make the plants being more susceptible to disease? So if that's true, and if you agree, do you think nitrogen reduction can help with disease pressure?
I don't know the very technical detail about whether nitrogen is affecting cell walls and so forth, because I'm not a nitrogen expert, but certainly we generally see reduced disease with lower N rates. I mean, that's quite well documented in the literature as well as being observed in our own experiments.
Great, thank you for that. Maybe another one more linked to application. There's a lot of questions around that. So when would be the best time to reduce your nitrogen if it's required?
Yeah, so again, as I said, I'm not a nitrogen expert myself, and I have asked my colleague Pete Berry this question, and I can't remember his word for word reply, but it was along the lines of you would reduce it at each split unless you were looking at a second wheat. Can you remember more clearly, John, Pete's answer? I can look it up, actually. I've got his response.
Yeah, so what I'd refer people to is that AHDB report, the review that Julie presented on one of her slides. It was the report number 97, I think. And in there, Pete Berry and colleagues do explore where nitrogen should be reduced. If nitrogen is reduced, how that impacts on splits. And yeah, I think the headline, the overarching conclusion was that if nitrogen is being reduced, then actually reduce each split equally by the same proportion. Unless, as Julie alluded to, you've got high risk of take-all, or if you're in barley, winter or spring barley. And at that point, you'd maintain, the outcome of that review is that you'd maintain the first split in terms of nitrogen dose. The other one was around milling wheat, and certainly with milling wheat, the recommendation from AHDB and ADAS in that report was to maintain levels of nitrogen as per RB209. Because I think we do widely acknowledge that actually nitrogen still is the key, a key building block and a fundamental building block for yield.
Perfect. Yeah, many thanks for that. We've got many questions in the same spirit, which are in a given situation with a fixed budget at the moment, given the prices. How do I spend an extra money on nitrogen or fungicide or trace elements? So how could I make that decision right now?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to comment on that one. So I think if you refer back to some of Julie's data that she's just shown, there is a clear difference now between the ability of fungicides to control disease and ultimately to enhance nitrogen utilization by a plant through that means. So actually there is if nitrogen applications are limited, actually using correct inputs and using the strongest inputs can go some way in mitigating some of the loss in yield. And actually Julie's data indicates that actually, as she alluded to, if you reduce your level of nitrogen, you can actually, by using Revastar, you can get the same yield from a lower level of nitrogen input than you can with conventional fungicides. But what's interesting in that data set is regardless of your dose of nitrogen, as you increase the dose of nitrogen, you still get enhanced yield even with the strongest fungicides. So it's not quite as simple as choosing between one or the other, because there are key implications for reducing nitrogen, and there are also key implications for reducing disease control, reducing fungicide that needs to be considered from a disease control perspective. Mm-hmm. And actually the key way to maximize yields and the key way to maximize yield potential of a crop is to utilize nitrogen and to utilize the strongest fungicides in complementary in order to drive yield, particularly at current grain prices as they stand at the moment.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a lot of other questions, which I'm afraid we can't answer, conscious of the time. Thank you very much, John and Julie, for your time and input this morning. I think it's of great interest.